Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by GoCollect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector and the host of the GoCollect speculation video, and I want to welcome you to another episode. In this episode, I am going to spend some time talking about a couple of blog posts. And there are honestly some good blog posts that we are going to be talking about this week. There is one that is very different from anything that we have spoken about on this channel before. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it because it was a different perspective, and I think you will enjoy it as well. The very first blog post, as I alluded to a few moments ago, is very different. And this one is different because we are literally getting an insider's point of view about the movies and the impact that the movies can have on the values of comics. And this blog post from this first blogger is done by a cast member that actually worked on Batman versus Superman. And this was someone that literally worked with Zack Snyder. And in this blog post, they give us a purview into how Zack Snyder and potentially other savvy directors actually use misdirection and the media to put rumors out there for people to consume. And the blogger kind of highlights that some of this misdirection, some of this footage that gets shot that is not even ever going to be used, but simply gets shot to misdirect people, the impact that those things can have on speculation, and of course, how all of us go about spending money. Fascinating article, let me tell you. I encourage you to go down to the description, find this link, go over to GoCollect and check this one out. So this next blog post is essentially a state of the comic book market type of post. And this is actually the fourth installment that this blogger has actually done, in which they are essentially trying to do a pulse check of the comic market. And what they're basically doing is spot checking a couple of books from the various ages and evaluating where those books are falling in the overall value spectrum. And I'm only going to touch on two books, two ages, but there are several others that are contained in the blog post that you may want to read for yourself. The very first book that the blogger talks about from the Silver Age is Submariner #1 from 1968. And the blogger points out here that this is potentially a desirable book because a lot of people are speculating that the Submariner is going to appear in the MCU based upon some rumors that are floating out there and what we saw in the Avengers movie. The blogger highlights that a CGC 9.8 copy of this book was recently auctioned off. The book started at 99 cents and it very quickly over that 7-day period ramped up to $8,400. And according to GoCollect, that is pretty much in line with the overall FMV of this particular book. GoCollect actually has it listed for $8,250, so it essentially went for a couple of bucks above FMV. The blogger goes on to talk about a few more books, and as I mentioned, I'm only going to talk about one more, and specifically one from the Bronze Age. And that book is Daredevil issue number 131 from 1976. This book is the origin and first appearance of Bullseye. The blogger highlights here that a 9.8 copy of this book sold a few weeks ago on eBay, specifically on August 23rd, for $1,900. And this is actually below FMV. GoCollect actually has that listed at about $2,000. And mind you, there have only been about 5 sales of this particular book, But again, there are deals, if you will, to be had. As I alluded to in the intro, the next blogger actually has 2 articles that he has written. And in both of these articles, he's basically looking at undervalued books that have not yet realized their fullest potential according to the blogger. The first book, and maybe even title, that the blogger is talking about is Batman Beyond. And the issue number 1 of this series is actually the first time we see Terry McGinnis in a comic. And there is a ton of excitement about this character right now. DC, unfortunately, recently canceled the Batman Beyond series. This is actually the 6th series that has been started and canceled. They canceled it, and who knows what the future will be. But regardless of what has happened with the series, this is an awesome character. It's a character that people are excited about, partly because of the cartoon that used to exist. But there's a lot of excitement here. And I don't think that this book, like the blogger, I don't think that this book has reached its full potential. If you believe in Batman, if you believe in Batman Beyond, this is one that you may want to take a look at. The very next book that the blogger talks about, technically it's 2 books, so I'm going to cheat just a little bit, but the blogger talks about Jack King Kirby and essentially highlights 2 books that were created by Jack, specifically Demon #1 from 1972 and also Sandman #1. And these are books that don't really need an introduction because they're Jack King Kirby creations. So you know that the artwork is going to be fantastic. I will tell you that in many respects, both of these books and many of the books, honestly, that Jack Kirby worked on at DC are undervalued books, unlike the Marvel books that he worked on. And so there could potentially be some magic that gets made with these books, because at some point people are potentially going to start paying attention. Maybe if DC gets its act together and starts to put out some really good movies, we could see some momentum and some magic happen. And again, I want to encourage you to check out this blog post. Read the argument that the blogger is making for the various recommendations that they are making. And once you do that, make some decisions for yourself. So I could not help but laugh as I read this next blog post. And I laughed because I actually have a blog post about this very topic on my website, regiecollects.com. The blogger in both cases is essentially talking about the problem with the modern era of comics. The eras by and large for comics are relatively short in duration, but for some reason or another, the modern era has essentially been the last 40 years. So even as a 40-year-old, I like to think that I'm modern, but I also realize that I've had some different kinds of eras within my own 40 years that I would choose to delineate. And so this blogger actually does a pretty good job of basically saying 40 years is too long of a time period. We need to break this thing up. We need to delineate it. We need to do something better, because 40 years is just too long of a time period to basically call something a modern comic, especially when there's so many different nuances to the last 40 years. If you want to get in on this argument, and I want to encourage you to do so, if you want to get in, head down to the comment section. Let us know what your thoughts are. So let's talk about those undervalued Marvel comics from the last several eras, all the way from the Golden Age to the modern. The very first one that I want to touch on is the modern book that is identified in the post. And the blogger talks about Bloodstone #1 from 2001. And this is actually the first appearance of a character named Elsa Bloodstone. I don't don't know anything about this character. But again, the blogger does a good job of basically saying, here's a book, here's why it's relevant, here's my rationale behind why I'm making this recommendation. And for this particular book of Bloodstone #1, the blogger's making the recommendation here because they believe that Marvel is going to enter a phase, potentially with the New Mutants movie, but certainly with the Blade movie that will happen at some point, the phase of the Darkseid. And this character, Bloodstone, is, I guess, entrenched in that magical underworld dark side of Marvel. And they're basically saying that this book could be one that becomes hot at some point down the road. The next recommendation that the blogger talks about is one that I really dig. I had never seen this cover before, and I don't know if I will ever be able to unsee it because it is a really awesome cover featuring the Submariner. The book in question is Submariner Comics number 34 from 1954. This is a gorgeous yellow cover featuring the Submariner. It is an awesome book. And as we talked about earlier in this episode, the Submariner is a fantastic character, has some long-term potential for actually being able to appear in the MCU, first as a villain and then maybe transitioning to a hero, then maybe even back to a villain, because that is the nature of the Submariner. I would love to have this book, I'll be completely honest. Yeah, we'll just leave it there. The link to this blog post down in the description. Check it out. I mentioned 2 books, but there's a couple of others that may interest you as well. So there are some parent-child relationships that we all know about, right? Ones that are pretty readily apparent, like Cyclops and Jean Grey's kids are Rachel Summers and Cable. We know that. Damian's dad is Batman Bruce Wayne. We know Valeria and Franklin Richards' parents are Reed and Sue Storm. We know that. But there are some parent-child relationships that are not as well known or as, I think, readily apparent. And I'll be completely honest, there are some children on here I had never heard of before. But to me, that is the fun of these blog posts. I learned a little something, and maybe you guys do as well. So you definitely want to check out this blog post so that you can get all the details. But I will talk about a couple of these children and their parents. And the very first one is Enigma. And Enigma is the daughter of the Riddler. Didn't know he had a kid, but I do now know that her first appearance was in Teen Titans Volume 3, issue number 38. And now I am also curious to see whether she is as off as her dad. The very next character I think is a pretty interesting one. This is Rose Wilson, and she is the daughter of one of the most feared assassins and mercenaries in DC comic, that being Deathstroke. And Deathstroke's daughter had her first appearance in Deathstroke the Terminator issue number 15. And this character I think is interesting because she literally has the same powers as her father. So I definitely want to check that one out to see how she mixes it up in the comics. But again, there are some other characters that are mentioned in this blog post, so you definitely want to check these out as well. The link down in the description. So there you have it. We have reached the end of another week, and I want to thank you all for all of the fantastic comments that you left on the last video. I enjoy reading your comments and your thoughts, having a little bit of back and forth, and I definitely want to encourage you all to keep that up. And I also want to encourage you to come back next week when we get to do this all over again.